For 10 years since the night his wife died in a crash that shattered everything he believed about safety and certainty, Daniel Carter had never looked at another woman for longer than 3 seconds. He was a billionaire, powerful and untouchable. A man who built towers that scraped the clouds, while his own heart stayed sealed beneath a layer of ice no one could melt. Then came one ordinary morning that was never meant to be remarkable, when a young woman came sprinting toward a closing elevator, collided with him by accident, and left behind nothing but a scarf and a trace of perfume that, for the first time in a decade, made his entire world tremble. He did not yet know that those 5 seconds would rewrite the rest of his life, or that the woman racing across that marble lobby would eventually teach him the difference between surviving and actually living again. Daniel Carter was 42 years old, and to most of the country he was simply a name printed on glass towers and financial headlines. The man the press had nicknamed the Ice Billionaire. He had built one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast. His name etched into skylines from Boston to Miami, his signature on contracts that reshaped entire neighborhoods. Yet anyone who had ever shared a boardroom with him would say the same thing. Warmth was not a language Daniel spoke. He wore tailored charcoal suits that fit like armor, drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, and lived in a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking a city that admired him from a distance it never dared to close. 10 years earlier, on the night of his wedding anniversary, his wife had died in a car accident on a rain-soaked highway, and Daniel had spent every year since blaming himself for a decision he could never undo, a single choice that had sent her down that road instead of him. He had been the one running late that night, the one who had asked her to pick up the reservation he had forgotten to confirm. And somewhere in that small, unremarkable favor lived a guilt so heavy it had reshaped the entire architecture of his life. The funeral had been small and quiet, the way she would have wanted it. But Daniel had walked out of that church a different man entirely. One who decided, somewhere between the eulogy and the burial, that love was simply too expensive a risk to take again. He had refused every attempt at connection since that night, turning down dinners arranged by well-meaning friends, ignoring introductions orchestrated by business partners who thought a wife might soften his image for the cameras. His days followed a punishing rhythm. 18 hours of work pressed into every waking moment. No parties he did not absolutely have to attend. No dates, no unnecessary conversation with any woman who might remind him of what he had lost. The employees at Carter Group had learned the unspoken rule passed quietly from one new hire to the next, a piece of office folklore repeated like scripture in the break room and whispered in elevators. If the CEO steps into the elevator, do not stand too close, do not speak unless spoken to, and never, under any circumstance, ask him a personal question. New assistants were warned within their first week. Veteran staff simply nodded whenever his name came up, as though discussing the weather of a country no one wanted to visit. Most people who worked beneath those glass ceilings assumed Daniel Carter simply did not feel anything at all. That somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced his capacity for emotion entirely, the way frostbite replaces feeling in a limb left too long in the cold. But the truth, hidden behind every closed office door and every late-night signature on another acquisition, was far simpler and far more painful than indifference. Daniel did not avoid connection because his heart was empty. He avoided it because he knew exactly how much it could break. Because he had already felt what it meant to lose someone without warning. And he could not survive breaking that way a second time. On a gray Tuesday morning that looked like every other morning before it, Daniel walked into the lobby of Carter Tower, exactly 4 minutes earlier than usual, his driver having taken a faster route through traffic that should have been impossible at that hour. He carried his coffee in one hand and a folder of merger documents in the other, his mind already 3 meetings ahead, already calculating numbers that meant nothing to anyone but men like him. Sunlight cut sharp angles across the polished marble floor, catching the glass walls of the lobby in a way that made the whole space feel like the inside of a perfectly cut diamond, cold and brilliant and entirely without warmth. He had no reason to believe this particular morning would be different from the 3,650 mornings that had come before it since his wife had died. He stepped toward the executive elevator at the far end of the lobby, the one reserved for the top 3 floors, The one his employees joked was colder than the man who wrote it. The doors began to slide shut in their slow mechanical rhythm, and Daniel did exactly what he always did, which was nothing at all, content to let the doors close and wait for the next available car, like any other tenant in his own building. He had no idea that across the lobby, a young woman was running toward that very elevator, as if her entire future depended on making it through those doors in time. Emily Harper was 29 years old, an independent architect with a portfolio full of unfinished dreams and a reputation among her small circle of colleagues for being relentlessly thorough, endlessly warm, and almost comically unlucky with mornings. She rented a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat 3 subway stops from downtown, kept a sketchbook in every bag she owned, and had spent the better part of 2 years refining a single concept she believed in more than she believed in almost anything else. A vision for affordable housing that did not sacrifice beauty for budget. Her father had been a carpenter who taught her that a well-built thing should last for generations, and her mother had been a schoolteacher who taught her that kindness was never wasted, and somewhere between those two lessons, Emily had built an entire philosophy of design she carried with her into every interview, every late night, every rejection letter she had learned not to take personally. She had an interview that day with Carter Group, a chance to pitch that very concept, the kind of opportunity that did not come twice to someone without a famous last name or an Ivy League pedigree behind her. Traffic had stolen 40 minutes from her that morning. A delivery truck had stolen another 5, and somewhere between her apartment and the lobby of Carter Tower, half her printed proposal had slipped from a folder she had been clutching too loosely, while running for a bus that left without her anyway. She had gathered the loose papers with shaking hands on the sidewalk outside, stuffing them back into the folder without bothering to check the order, her heartbeat already pounding by the time she reached the revolving doors. She could see the elevator across the lobby beginning to close, the only car heading directly to the floor where her interview waited, and she made the kind of split-second decision that only desperation can justify. She ran, heels striking marble in a sound that echoed off the glass walls, folder pressed against her chest like a shield, calling out something that was meant to be words but came out as little more than a breathless plea for the doors to wait just one more second. Daniel heard the sound before he understood it, a rush of footsteps and a voice cutting through the lobby's usual hush, and some instinct older than logic made his hand shoot out to catch the closing door before his mind had even finished processing why he was bothering. Emily came through the gap at full speed, unable to stop herself in time, and crashed directly into the chest of a man she had not even registered as a person, only as an obstacle she desperately needed to get past. The folder burst open between them, papers scattering across the elevator floor like startled birds caught mid-flight, and both of them dropped to their knees at the same instant, reaching for the same falling pages without thinking. Their hands brushed against a single sheet of paper at the same moment. And when they finally looked up to apologize, their eyes met for the first time, close enough that neither of them could pretend not to notice the other's face. It lasted only a few seconds, the kind of moment that means nothing to a clock and everything to a heart that has forgotten how to feel anything at all. For the first time in 10 years, Daniel Carter forgot to step out of an elevator, forgot the meeting waiting 3 floors above him, forgot, for just an instant, the careful armor he had built around every hour of his life. Emily, mortified and certain she had just ruined her one chance at a job she desperately needed, apologized in a flustered rush of words, gathering her papers and pressing the button for her floor, before practically fleeing the elevator. The moment the doors opened on a higher level, she did not look back. She did not see the man behind her bend down a second time. Not for paper this time, but for a soft gray scarf that had slipped from around her neck in the chaos, and now lay forgotten on the elevator floor like a question left unanswered. Daniel lifted it carefully, the way a man might lift something fragile without quite understanding why he was being so careful with it, and the faint trace of her perfume reached him before he even realized he was breathing it in. It was a simple scent, something warm and quietly familiar, nothing like the expensive fragrances worn by the women who occasionally crossed his path at galas and shareholder dinners, filled with crystal glasses and rehearsed laughter. Yet standing alone in that elevator with the scarf still in his hands, the doors closing behind him, on an empty car, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest that he could not name and was not entirely sure he wanted to examine too closely. When his assistant later offered to take the scarf and have it sent to Lost and Found, Daniel surprised them both by quietly slipping it into his coat pocket instead, telling himself it was simply easier to return it himself. In the days that followed, something strange and unfamiliar began happening to the most disciplined man in the company. For the first time since his wife's death, Daniel found himself remembering a woman's face in vivid, frustrating detail. The curve of her cheek, the panic in her eyes, the way her voice had cracked when she apologized before disappearing into the elevator's upper floors. He found himself losing concentration during board meetings that would once have commanded his total attention. His gaze drifting toward the window, his mind replaying 5 seconds of contact over and over, as if searching for a clue he had somehow missed in the chaos of falling paper. He stopped sleeping properly, lying awake at 2 in the morning in a penthouse so quiet he could hear the hum of the city far below, the scarf folded neatly on his nightstand, staring at it the way other men stared at old photographs they could not bring themselves to put away. His assistant, a sharp and unflappable woman named Patricia, who had worked for him for almost 8 years and had buried more secrets for him than any therapist ever could, noticed the change immediately and said nothing, though she clocked every distracted pause and every unfinished sentence with quiet alarm. When Daniel finally called her into his office and asked her, in a voice that sounded almost embarrassed, to find out the identity of the young woman who had come in for an interview that particular Tuesday morning, Patricia simply nodded and did not ask why. Daniel told himself he only wanted to return the scarf, that any reasonable, considerate person would want to return a lost item to its owner without making it complicated. He did not examine too closely the fact that he could have simply mailed it through the front desk, or the fact that some quieter, more honest part of him suspected his reasons went deeper than simple courtesy ever could. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily had no idea that the man she had crashed into in that elevator was not some senior employee rushing to an unrelated meeting, but the very founder and chief executive whose signature would determine whether her proposal ever saw the light of day. She assumed, reasonably enough, that she would never see him again, and tucked the strange, electric memory of his eyes away somewhere she did not plan on revisiting, telling herself it had simply been an embarrassing accident and nothing more. 2 weeks later, Emily received the call she had been hoping for, informing her that she had cleared the first round of interviews and would be invited to present her housing proposal in person to a small panel of senior executives in one of the company's glass-walled conference rooms. She spent every spare hour preparing, refining her slides late into the night, rehearsing her opening line until it felt less like a pitch and more like a conversation between two people who already understood each other. She practiced in front of her bathroom mirror, in front of her sketchbook, in front of anyone in her life patient enough to listen, determined not to let nerves cost her this opportunity the way nerves had cost her so many things before. On the morning of the presentation, she walked into a glass conference room high above the city with her chin lifted and her voice steady, unaware that the man who had returned her gaze in that elevator was seated quietly at the far end of the table, deliberately positioned where she would not immediately recognize him as the one signing off on every decision in the room. No one in that meeting revealed his identity to her directly, and Daniel had instructed his team beforehand to introduce him only by his first name, Curious, in a way he could not fully explain even to himself, to hear what she would say when she did not know who was listening, or who held the power to end her career before it began. Emily spoke with a clarity and conviction that silenced the usual murmured side conversations that filled most pitch meetings, describing not just floor plans and material costs, but the lives she imagined unfolding inside the buildings she wanted to design. She talked about courtyards, where children could play safely, about windows angled to catch the last warm light of evening, about hallways wide enough for neighbors to actually stop and talk to one another instead of rushing past in silence. What struck Daniel most was not her appearance, though he would later admit, quietly and only to himself, that he had noticed everything about her appearance within the first 10 seconds she walked through the door. What struck him instead was the way she spoke about architecture, the conviction in a single sentence she delivered near the end of her presentation when she said that a beautiful building should make people want to come home to it. It was a phrase that landed in Daniel's chest like a struck bell, because it was almost word for word something his late wife had once said to him on the night they first walked through the blueprints of their own house together, years before either of them could have imagined how that house would eventually echo with absence instead of laughter. He sat perfectly still for a long moment after Emily finished speaking, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, the corners of his mouth lifted into something resembling an actual smile. The other men and women at the table exchanged glances of quiet approval, scribbling notes about budget projections and timeline estimates, entirely unaware that their chairman had stopped listening for budget numbers somewhere around the third slide. Daniel found himself studying the small, unconscious habits that seemed to belong only to her. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear before answering a difficult question, the way her hands moved through the air as though she were sketching the building right there in front of them rather than simply describing it. For a man who had spent a decade reducing every interaction to numbers and outcomes, the experience of being quietly captivated by another human being again felt almost disorienting, like remembering a language he had not spoken in years. After the meeting concluded, and the other executives filed out with their tablets and their polite congratulations, Daniel asked Emily to stay behind for a moment, and she assumed, with a sinking heart, that she was about to be told her proposal had failed, despite how well it seemed to have gone. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced the gray scarf she had lost weeks earlier, folded with a care that suggested it had not simply been sitting in a drawer somewhere, forgotten and ignored. Emily stared at it, then at him, recognition flooding her face, as she finally understood exactly who the stranger from the elevator had been all along, and the realization left her too stunned to speak for several seconds, while the city hummed silently beyond the glass behind him. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began arranging encounters that he told himself were entirely coincidental, though anyone watching closely might have noticed how carefully timed those coincidences turned out to be. He appeared at the same small coffee shop near Carter Tower on the mornings Emily usually stopped in before work, lingering over a black coffee he did not particularly want simply for the chance to exchange a few words with her before the day pulled them in separate directions. He found reasons to visit the public library 2 blocks from her apartment, claiming he was researching a new development project, though the books he checked out had little to do with real estate and everything to do with finding an excuse to be where she might also be. When a private architecture exhibition opened downtown, featuring scale models of buildings from around the world lit dramatically beneath soft gallery lighting, Daniel arranged for an extra invitation to land on Emily's desk, careful to ensure it appeared to come from the gallery itself rather than from him. They walked together past illuminated models of cathedrals and concert halls, their voices low against the hush of the gallery, and at one point Daniel pointed out a tiny architectural flaw in a famous design that no critic had ever publicly noted, a detail so specific that Emily laughed out loud, startling a nearby security guard, who had clearly never heard laughter echo through that particular room before. Slowly, across coffee cups and gallery floors and quiet conversations that stretched longer than either of them intended, the two of them began talking in a way that had nothing to do with proposals or business at all. Emily discovered that the man the press described as cold and unreachable actually understood art with surprising depth, could discuss classical composers with genuine enthusiasm, and even knew his way around a kitchen well enough to describe, in unexpected detail, the proper way to prepare a simple pasta dish from scratch using nothing but garlic, good olive oil, and patience. What she also noticed, though she did not press him on it at first, was the careful, deliberate way Daniel avoided any mention of his family, his past, or anything that might require him to speak about the years before they met. He laughed more in those few weeks than his own employees had seen him laugh in years, a fact that did not go unnoticed inside Carter Tower, where rumors began to circulate quietly among staff who could not quite believe the transformation taking place in front of them. Patricia, who had watched Daniel grieve in near silence for nearly a decade, found herself blinking back unexpected tears one afternoon, simply from the sound of her boss laughing behind a closed office door, a sound she had genuinely begun to wonder if she would ever hear again. It was during one of these visits, An evening when Daniel had invited Emily to his penthouse to discuss a potential collaboration on a new community project over a dinner he had insisted on cooking himself, that Emily wandered briefly down a hallway while waiting for him to finish a phone call, and pushed open a door she assumed led to a study. Instead, she found herself standing in a room frozen in time. The walls lined with photographs of a woman she had never met, smiling in places Daniel had clearly once visited with joy rather than obligation, beaches and gardens and quiet porches captured in light that no longer existed anywhere except inside those frames. On a small writing desk in the corner sat a stack of letters, many of them sealed and addressed, but never sent. And beside them, displayed with quiet reverence, a wedding ring that had clearly not been worn in a very long time. Daniel found her standing there a few minutes later, and rather than anger or embarrassment, what crossed his face was something closer to relief, as though some part of him had been waiting for someone to finally see this room and understand, without needing every detail explained. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, the photographs watching silently from the walls, as though they too had been waiting a decade for this exact conversation to finally happen. He told her everything that night, sitting across from her in a living room, lit only by a single lamp and the distant glow of the city through the window. The story of the accident, the years of guilt, the decision he had made, without ever fully realizing it, to stop living and simply continue working instead. He confessed that for 10 years he had measured his days not by happiness but by productivity, mistaking exhaustion for purpose because purpose felt safer than grief, and because building towers required less courage than rebuilding a heart. Emily listened without interrupting, without offering the kind of hollow comfort people often reach for when they do not know what else to say, and when he finally finished speaking, she did not respond with pity. She told him, gently but without hesitation, that no one who truly loved someone would want that person to spend the rest of their life suffering on their behalf, that grief honored honestly looked nothing like a decade of silence behind a locked door. It was a simple sentence, quietly spoken, but it landed in Daniel with a force that 10 years of silence had never managed to produce. And for the first time since the funeral, he allowed himself to cry in front of another person, his shoulders shaking in a way that felt almost foreign to him after so many years of careful control. That confession should have brought them closer together permanently, but instead it opened a different kind of distance neither of them had anticipated in the weeks that followed. In the days after that conversation, Emily found herself wrestling with a fear she could not quite shake. A quiet, persistent worry that perhaps Daniel did not see her as Emily at all, but as a reflection of the woman whose photographs still lined that hidden room, a comparison she could never hope to win and did not even want to compete in. She began pulling back from him without fully explaining why, declining invitations, keeping conversations short and professional, until finally, she made the difficult decision to resign from the project altogether rather than risk becoming a permanent stand-in for someone else's unfinished grief. Daniel was blindsided by her resignation letter, reading it twice in his office at midnight before he fully understood what it meant. And for the first time in his adult life, he abandoned a scheduled board meeting the next morning, without explanation, to chase down a person rather than a deal. He ignored the reporters who had begun loitering near Carter Tower after rumors of his unusual behavior started circulating in gossip columns hungry for any crack in his famously composed image. He ignored the careful image he had spent a decade constructing, and drove himself, without a driver, across town to the small apartment building where Emily lived above the laundromat she had once mentioned offhand during one of their conversations. When he arrived, she refused to come down, asking a neighbor to relay the message that she needed time and space rather than another conversation she was not ready to have, no matter how sincere his intentions seemed to be. Standing on that sidewalk, staring up at a window that remained stubbornly closed against the evening light, Daniel understood with sudden, painful clarity that silence had already cost him one woman he loved, and he was not willing to let it cost him a second. He realized that vague gestures and careful avoidance of the truth had brought them to this point, and that the only way forward was honesty delivered plainly, without the protective distance he had relied on for so long to keep himself safe from exactly this kind of pain. He left that evening without seeing her. But he did not leave without a plan. One that required him to return to the exact place where all of this had begun, the one location that held more meaning for both of them than any restaurant or rooftop garden ever could. A week later, Daniel sent Emily a single message asking her to meet him, not at his office, not at a restaurant, but at the lobby of Carter Tower, beside the very elevator where they had first collided all those months earlier. Curiosity, or perhaps something deeper she was not yet ready to name, brought Emily there on a quiet evening, after the building had mostly emptied for the day, the marble floors gleaming under soft lobby lighting just as they had on that first chaotic morning. Daniel was already waiting when she arrived, standing exactly where he had stood that first morning, the scarf, freshly cleaned and carefully folded, resting in his hands. He told her that on the day she had not simply stepped into an elevator, she had stepped into his life. Cracking open a door he had spent a decade keeping sealed shut against the world. Brick by brick, year by year, until he had almost convinced himself that the door no longer existed at all. He admitted, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of what he was saying, that he had once truly believed he would never again allow himself to feel anything for another person, as long as he lived, that he had built an entire identity around the certainty of that belief. But Emily, he said, had not replaced anyone, had not become a substitute for a memory he carried, but had instead become the reason he finally remembered how to keep living rather than simply surviving from one quarterly report to the next. He told her that loving her did not erase the past, did not dishonor the years he had spent grieving, but had instead given those years somewhere to finally rest. Emily felt tears slide down her face as she listened, the weight of months of uncertainty finally finding somewhere to land. But even as her heart ached with everything he had just confessed, she did not immediately answer him, needing a moment simply to breathe inside the enormity of what he had just laid bare in front of her. She needed time to be certain that what stood between them was real, and not simply the echo of grief finding a convenient shape to wear. And Daniel, watching her walk away that evening without a definitive answer, found himself facing the very real possibility that honesty alone might not be enough to win her back after everything that had happened between them. Word of their unusual relationship eventually reached the press, as these things always do in a city built on gossip and headlines hungry for any story that involved money, mystery, and a billionaire long assumed incapable of feeling anything at all. Within days, the story of the reclusive billionaire and the young architect became impossible to contain, splashed across business pages and tabloid covers alike, with photographs taken from across the street. Reporters speculated wildly about Emily's motives, painting her in some publications as an opportunist who had engineered her way into Daniel's affections for financial gain, ignoring entirely the 2 years of work she had poured into a housing concept that had nothing to do with him at all. Members of the Carter Group board, never fully comfortable with their chairman's sudden change in demeanor, used the controversy as an opportunity to question his judgment and, by extension, his fitness to continue leading the company without distraction or scandal trailing behind him. Closed-door meetings filled with raised voices became more frequent, and Daniel found himself defending not just a relationship, but an entire decade of decisions he had never before been asked to justify to anyone. The pressure mounted quickly, and Emily, exhausted by accusations she had never asked for and unwilling to become a permanent target for tabloids hungry for a villain in a story that was never hers to begin with, made the painful decision to step away entirely, both from the project and from Daniel himself. She told herself it was the right thing to do, that perhaps the simplest way to protect them both was to remove herself from a spotlight she had never wanted in the first place, returning instead to the quiet anonymity of her small apartment and her sketchbooks full of unfinished dreams. For Daniel, her absence felt like watching history repeat itself in slow motion, except this time, he refused to simply stand by and let it happen without a fight. For the first time in his career, Daniel called a press conference not to announce a merger or a quarterly earnings report, but to speak about himself, something he had avoided doing publicly for the entirety of his professional life. Standing before a room full of cameras and reporters who had spent weeks speculating about his private life, surrounded by the glass and steel of a lobby he had built with his own ambition, Daniel spoke plainly, without notes, without the careful corporate language his communications team had drafted for him the night before. He told them that he had built hundreds of buildings across dozens of cities over the course of his career, towers and homes and offices that would likely outlast him by generations and stand long after his name had faded from any headline. But none of those buildings, he said, his voice steady even as the words clearly cost him something, had ever done what one person managed to do without even trying, which was rebuild the parts of him that grief had quietly torn down 10 years earlier, beam by beam, until there was almost nothing left standing at all. He spoke about loss without flinching, about the decade he had spent mistaking numbness for strength, and about the woman who had walked into his life by accident and stayed by choice, refusing to let pity or scandal define what existed between them, despite every reason the world had given her to walk away. The speech, raw and entirely unlike anything the public had ever heard from him, spread across the country within hours, reshaping almost overnight the way people understood the man behind the headlines they had read for years without ever truly knowing him. Public opinion shifted with surprising speed. Sympathy replacing suspicion, as people who had never met either of them found themselves rooting for a love story that felt, for once, genuinely earned rather than manufactured for cameras. Strangers who had never set foot inside a Carter Group building began sharing clips of the speech with friends and family, drawn not to the wealth or the headlines but to the simple, unguarded honesty of a powerful man admitting he had been broken and was finally trying to heal. Board members who had pushed hardest against the relationship found their objections losing traction as shareholders, moved by the sincerity of his words, expressed support rather than concern in the days that followed his unscripted confession. Somewhere in a quiet apartment across the city, Emily watched that speech alone, hand pressed against her mouth, finally understanding the full weight of what Daniel had been trying to tell her all along, long before either of them had the words for it. A year passed, carrying with it changes neither of them could have predicted on that first chaotic morning by the elevator, when papers scattered across marble like startled birds. Emily returned not as an outside contractor chasing approval, but as the lead architect of the newly established Carter Foundation, an organization Daniel had created to fund community projects and memorial spaces across the cities where his company operated. She had her own office now, on a floor far above the lobby where everything had begun, with a window that caught the morning light, exactly the way she had once described in a presentation that had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Daniel himself had changed as well, no longer defined entirely by 18-hour workdays and empty evenings spent alone with spreadsheets, learning instead to leave the office at a reasonable hour, to take weekends that did not involve quarterly projections, to simply exist in moments that asked nothing productive of him at all. Together, the two of them poured their energy into a project that mattered more to both of them than any commercial development ever could, designing quiet memorial spaces dedicated to families who had lost loved ones in accidents, the kind of loss Daniel understood more intimately than he had ever wanted to share with anyone before Emily. Each space they designed carried small details meant to offer comfort rather than spectacle: benches positioned to catch the morning light, gardens planted with flowers that bloomed in every season, walls etched with names rather than statistics that could never capture what those names had actually meant to someone. It became, for both of them, a way of transforming pain into something that might ease someone else's pain in return, turning 10 years of private grief into a public gift offered quietly to strangers who would never know the full story behind the gesture. Visitors who wandered into those memorial gardens on ordinary afternoons had no idea that the man who funded them had once measured grief in 18-hour workdays, or that the woman who designed the gentle curve of every walking path had once been a stranger who simply ran for an elevator on a morning that started out like any other. Yet something in the careful, deliberate warmth of those spaces seemed to reach people anyway, as though love that has been fully felt leaves a kind of fingerprint behind, even when no name is ever attached to it. On the anniversary of the morning they had first collided in that elevator, Daniel asked Emily to meet him once more in the lobby of Carter Tower, telling her only that he wanted to mark the occasion somewhere meaningful, somewhere that mattered more than any expensive restaurant ever could. She arrived to find the lobby quiet, the same marble floors gleaming beneath the same soft lighting, and Daniel standing exactly where he had stood twice before, though this time his expression carried none of the uncertainty of their earlier conversations in that very same spot. He stepped toward her, took her hand, and without a single word of explanation, lowered himself to one knee right there beside the elevator doors that had changed both their lives more completely than either of them could have imagined on that ordinary Tuesday morning a year earlier. From his coat pocket, he produced the same gray scarf, kept safe and carefully preserved for an entire year through every argument and every reconciliation that had followed, and unfolded it slowly to reveal a ring nestled in its fabric. The metal catching the lobby light in a way that made Emily's breath catch in her throat before she even understood what she was looking at. He told her that 10 years earlier, he had lost the person he loved without warning and without the chance to say a proper goodbye, a wound he had carried in silence. For so long, he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to live without it. He told her that 1 year earlier, fate, or perhaps simple coincidence dressed up as fate, had returned to him something he had long since stopped believing he deserved, which was hope, delivered not through grand gesture but through a scarf left behind by a stranger running late for an interview. Emily, tears streaming freely down her face, did not need more than a few seconds to answer him. Her smile arriving before her words did, a quiet and certain yes that filled the lobby more completely than any speech ever could have managed. The elevator doors beside them slid open and closed again on their own mechanical schedule, indifferent to the moment unfolding in front of them, yet somehow perfectly symbolic of everything that had changed since the first time those same doors had closed between two strangers who had no idea what they were about to become to one another. This time, the doors did not represent an ending or a narrow escape from connection, but simply another beginning, another threshold two people were now choosing to walk through together, side by side, rather than as strangers brushing past each other in a hurry. The story closes not with grand declarations or crowded ballrooms, but with something far quieter and far more enduring, the image of two people stepping out of that same elevator together, hand in hand, onto a rooftop terrace, where the first light of morning was just beginning to spread across the skyline Daniel had spent his life building. The glass towers around them caught the early sun in long golden streaks, the city slowly waking beneath their feet, and for the first time in longer than either of them could measure, neither one of them was in a hurry to be anywhere else. For 10 years he had constructed towers of glass and steel, while keeping the most important room inside himself permanently locked, mistaking distance for protection and silence for strength. It took one accidental collision, one forgotten scarf, and one extraordinary woman rushing toward an elevator to finally show him that some doors, no matter how long they stay shut, are never truly closed for good. And standing together on that rooftop as the sun climbed higher over a city that had once known him only as cold and unreachable, Daniel finally understood what Emily had tried to tell him in that lamplit living room so many months before, that grief honored honestly does not mean a life lived in permanent winter, and that healing, however delayed, however unlikely it once seemed on a quiet Tuesday morning, always finds its way back to those patient enough to wait for it.